So, what if you could predict when customers are about to leave before they even make the decision themselves? Today, we're diving into how SMBs can use data to predict customer churn to help you retain your customers, to drive loyalty, and to boost revenue. Today, we're walking through why churn prediction is one of the first use cases that you could have when managing your data and introducing data science into your business rhythms. So diving in, why is churn prediction one of the best areas to start when thinking about your data strategy and utilizing data for better rhythm in your business? Customer churn prediction is actually one of the most accessible ways for SMBs to get started in data science. And really, we're thinking through the realm of like, how do you help your team proactively address retention issues? How do you give visibility into which customers need extra attention? And then how can you prevent time being wasted to upsell customers who really are at a high risk of leaving in the first place? A common use case here is simply a SaaS company who is looking at customer data that aren't engaging with their platform. Maybe they're not engaging in the first platform in the first week, the first 30 days, and there's a correlation of a high churn rate that comes out of that. So maybe for users that don't engage in the first 30 days, they have a 60% churn rate. We're driving towards how do we actually solve that problem to reduce the amount of customers that churn and then to predict future behavior. And so when we're able to implement strategies based on this data, things like let's implement a better onboarding campaign, let's increase engagement in the initial experience with our product, and then ultimately reduce that churn number. What we're trying to do is we're trying to capture data and start with very simple metrics. What was their last purchase date? What were customer support interactions? What are the product usage trends? Before we start to implement some like more advanced churn prediction modeling, but also before we start taking action, we need to start capturing the data at the source to understand how do we actually get started here. When we start to think about churn indicators by industry, there's a number of things that you can start looking at, signals that you can take to understand one or two layers deeper on how to create improvements on your customer retention. So SaaS, like I mentioned, it could be declining feature usage, fewer logins, increased support tickets. All of those things can be the rocky road that leads to churn. For an e-commerce business, it may be a decrease in order frequency, abandoned carts, or no email engagement at all. When you think about a subscription services type business, you can look at payment failures, skipped renewals, reduced engagement. Those are the types of things that you want to be looking for in order to start ideating around the types of data points that you can include in a data model to help be more predictive in this area. For professional services, it may be fewer inbound inquiries or fewer inquiries from the client, reduced email response rates, reduced invoice volume, or a general lack of engagement with your team that is servicing that company. When you start to see that customers are starting to skip 2 shipments, or they're not engaging in your email cadences, or maybe they really just aren't using the tool as you may intend them to, you have to be able to understand what is the type of code that you're implementing in your program to be able to track how users are engaging. You need to also be able to understand how are people actually engaging with your product. Do you have a feedback mechanism or loop to provide you with the data and able to understand what then is driving churn? And then you want to think about how do you engage them? How do you re-engage them in a really healthy way? So maybe you launch an automated discount campaign after a user skips the second subscription payment and pushes it on down the road. You can see examples of this with a lot of beauty products, companies like Harry's or others that set you up on a monthly subscription, but you can log into the app and you can modify when that shipment comes. You can say, I actually don't need it this month. I'm going to push it out to next month, or push it out 6 months from now. Well, that's an indicator that maybe 6 months from now, that user is at a higher risk of churn. And so if you have the ability to capture how are users behaving with your product, how are they modifying their relationship to you in a way that suits them, that one, gives you an opportunity to re-engage them in a more intentional manner, but two, also enables you to think better about how you're actually engaging them in the first place. What is the right subscription to have them on in order to drive retention? So if you can start to track industry-specific signals and experiment with different engagement techniques, you can really start to see what works in order to drive retention. So then how do we start thinking about building a churn prediction model? This is something that's learning over time. It's improving its accuracy with more and more data that we've talked about. So the more data, the more information that you're able to feed this model based on how your customers engage with your product, you now have a better chance of capturing that before the churn happens. So from a step-by-step process perspective, we need to start with a control population. We need to identify a historical data set of customers who have churned versus those that have stayed, to then begin to start identifying the levers that impact the churn. So of the customers that churned, were there key features such as login frequency, purchase recency, or customer support interactions that drove a pattern before they ultimately churned your product? When you're able to identify those levers in that control population, you then start to build a model. You train a machine learning algorithm to start recognizing those churn patterns. When you can then test those churn patterns against a control group, you now start to validate the accuracy of that model. You then want to be starting to evaluating results. You need to tweak them as needed. So you need to adjust the weighting of what's the relative weight of increased support tickets versus product usage. Does one of those two things have a deeper impact on the churn expectation? You need to look at the features and segmentation of this model in order to understand, are there segments of customers, maybe geographically, maybe demographically, that impact what drives that churn? So after we have a control population, we've identified the levers, we've built a model, we're testing against a control group, we're now evaluating the results and tweaking them. We want to publish and operationalize this model. So we want to deploy the model, we want to integrate it with a CRM system so that we can actually automate the actions that need to be taken based on the data, and then start to train your team on how to use the insights in order to drive ultimately the value of reduced churn to your team. So you can think about this like a gym membership, right? Gyms use member check-in data to help predict which members are likely to cancel. You see a lot of gyms at the beginning of the year put out all of these incentives to get people to the gym, to capture those New Year's resolution folks, and the gym memberships spike. Now, they may have a model that says, hey, we've got 2 months of non-attendance, 3 months of non-attendance, and we know that there's a huge indicator relative to non-attendance that may drive churn. So in month 1, month 2, we're going to implement a personalized outreach campaign to re-engage these members before they hit that 2-3 non-attendance month mark, in order to then increase retention by 15%, which then has a very material impact financially on the business. There's a lot of ways that you can start to engage those customers who you believe are at risk of churn. If you can work with a data analyst, or you can use an automated churn prediction tool, it may help you start small before scaling. One of these tools, if you're utilizing Stripe in a subscription business, you can turn on Stripe Sigma. It's a SQL-based querying tool to analyze transactional data more intentionally. However, what this doesn't do is it doesn't take in the holistic picture of the demographic data, the sales data that came in before this customer became online as a customer. And so it doesn't necessarily paint the full picture. It will just tell you what type of behaviors are happening from a financial subscription perspective. So it doesn't take the user behavior that's happening within the product that you were selling. So you can look at this very independently, very narrowly in a tool like Stripe Sigma, but ultimately you're not getting the broader picture of what's actually causing that churn. A few ways that you can operationalize some of these churn insights is by taking a look at things like tagging customers by risk level. If you have a model that tells you we're getting closer and closer to an at-risk churn, you could start to tag them based on how close they are to that anticipated churn. Maybe the high-risk customers get immediate outreach. Medium-risk customers just get a little bit more engagement. Maybe it's an email campaign. And low-risk customers, we actually don't do anything with quite yet, but we want to keep an eye on them to start engaging them if they reach that medium-risk cohort. You can start to then customize your retention strategies and offer special incentives based on segments of the data that you're looking at, and then go even further up into the pipeline of new customers coming in and adjust your marketing and sales efforts. So you can start to focus your sales efforts on customers who are more likely to stay rather than wasting time on those who you now have an understanding of a higher predictability of churn after several months. Once we start to integrate churn predictions into daily operations through some of these automated workflows, through some of this tagging, through some of this connected interface of how your data is operating from an operational lens to a sales lens to a marketing lens, and then ultimately financial, you now have the ability to really start to take good action on this. What we often see from a pitfall standpoint is that people use too few data points. You need to ensure that your model has a broad enough data set to identify meaningful patterns. We also see folks that aren't actually acting on the insights. Maybe they have a rich data set. Maybe they understand how their customers are churning and why they're churning, but they're actually not taking that next step to integrate the learnings into an email campaign, into a customer support rhythm that helps your customers stay on board. We also see that a lot of folks will take data and then ultimately treat all customers the same. When we see application of the data from a churn learnings perspective into tailored engagement and tailored efforts based on the churn risk levels, based on the demographic, based on the geographical factors, we can now more influence customer behavior in our platform. So there's a lot of ways that you can start to slice and dice churn prediction, slice and dice user behavior on your platform or like within your service. We think that it's really one of the easiest and most impactful use cases for SMBs to start thinking about how do we start building a good data rhythm in our business. If you can start to use features like tagging and automation in order to capture the data and then trigger actions on the back end, we're now starting to create action out of it, which is the first step after getting clean data in order to drive value. I would encourage you to start to analyze what type of churn patterns can you find in your data sets and explore how you can actually apply those to drive action that ultimately will drive value and drive customer retention in order to drive more profitability, more efficiency, and a better outcome for your business. Thanks for tuning into Data Fuel. We hope today's insights help fuel your SMB's growth. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, review the podcast so we can keep bringing you more data-driven strategies. Till next time, keep fueling your business with data.